Nobody could explain it. Not the volunteers, not the coordinator, not even Alara, who had worked at that shelter for 11 years and believed she had seen just about everything an animal could do. But none of them had ever seen anything like this. A tiny blind kitten, smaller than an open hand, with pale fur and eyes completely clouded over like frosted glass, had just crossed the entire length of the room, slowly, deliberately, without a single moment of hesitation, and he was heading straight toward the one man every other animal in that shelter refused to go near. Alara's breath caught in her throat. "No, sweetheart," she whispered. "No, no, no." But Morris didn't stop. He never stopped. And in the weeks that followed, Alara would come to understand that what she witnessed that afternoon was not a coincidence. It was not a behavioral anomaly. It was not something that could be explained away with science or training manuals. It was something far older than any of that. Something that moves quietly between souls, across years, across loss, across the impossible distance between this world and whatever lies just beyond it. The Meadowbrook Animal Shelter sat on a calm residential street in Ashford, Connecticut, surrounded by tall oak trees whose branches creaked softly in the late September breeze. From the outside, it looked like any other modest building on the block. A little worn, a little tired, but warm, always warm. Inside, the air carried the familiar comfort of dry kibble, clean blankets, and the faint smell of lavender that Alara sprayed each morning because she believed it helped the animals feel calmer. Most days it worked, but not that day. That afternoon, the cats felt something before anyone else did. It started with the ones closest to the front door. A tabby named Biscuit pressed himself into the far corner of his enclosure and refused to move. A pair of sisters, orange tabbies who were usually inseparable and playful, retreated behind their shared litter box and stayed there, perfectly still. One by one, across the length of the room, every cat in that shelter went quiet, ears flat, eyes wide, bodies low. Alara noticed. She always noticed. But before she could figure out what was wrong, the front door opened and Calder Voss came in. He was a tall man, even in the wheelchair. Broad-shouldered, with large hands that rested heavily on his lap like they had forgotten what to do with themselves. His hair was silver gray and close-cropped. His face was deeply lined, not from laughter, but from years of something heavier than that. He didn't shout. He didn't slam doors. He didn't make sudden movements or raise his voice. He was, by every outward measure, a quiet man. But he carried something with him. Anyone who spent more than 5 minutes near Calder Voss could feel it. A stillness that was too still, a silence that pressed against the air around him like a physical weight. The kind of quiet that doesn't come from peace, but from a grief so deep and so long held that it has become the entire landscape of a person's life. The animals felt it immediately. They always did. Calder had been coming to the shelter for 3 weeks at that point, always on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, always staying for about 40 minutes, always leaving without having touched a single animal, because not a single animal would allow it. Alara had gently suggested once that perhaps the shelter wasn't the right fit for him. He had looked at her then, really looked at her, and something in his eyes made her take the words back before she even finished saying them. "I'll keep trying," he said quietly. "If that's all right." She had nodded. She didn't know why. She just had. Morris had arrived at the shelter 6 weeks earlier, on a rainy Wednesday morning. One of the volunteers had found him on the wooden porch of an old house 3 streets over, curled against a chipped clay flower pot as if trying to borrow its warmth. He was maybe 8 weeks old, though the vet wasn't certain. He was underweight, slightly dehydrated, and his eyes, both of them, were completely clouded over with the milky white film of congenital blindness. He had never seen a single thing in his short life, and yet, when the volunteer picked him up, he did not struggle. He did not cry out in fear the way most feral kittens do when handled by a stranger. He simply turned his small face toward hers, ears forward, nose working, and made a sound so soft it was almost not a sound at all, like a question, like a greeting. The vet confirmed what they suspected. Morris was completely blind, likely from birth, and the condition was permanent. He would never see light or shadow or the faces of the people who loved him, but he was healthy otherwise, strong-hearted, calm in a way that seemed almost impossible for a creature so small and so vulnerable. "He doesn't act like a blind cat," one of the younger volunteers observed one afternoon, watching Morris navigate navigate the shelter's back room with slow, precise steps, bumping into almost nothing. He acts like he knows exactly where he's going, Alara replied quietly. She had meant it as a simple observation. She had no idea yet how true it would turn out to be. The afternoon it happened was a Tuesday. The light through the shelter windows was the particular gold of late September, warm but fading, the kind of light that makes everything look like a memory. Alara was refilling water bowls in the main room when she heard the front door. The cats reacted first. Then Calder rolled in. He moved to his usual spot near the center of the room, the place he had chosen on his very first visit, equidistant from all the enclosures, as if trying not to favor any one direction. He sat there with his hands in his lap, looking at no one and nothing in particular, in the way of a man who has learned to make himself small, even though his grief takes up enormous space. Alara watched from the far side of the room. She was about to go check on Morris in the back room when she realized, with a small jolt of surprise, that she hadn't brought him back there at all. She had left him in the side corner of the main room, tucked inside his favorite worn-out cardboard box, lined with the faded blue blanket he had claimed as his own since his first week at the shelter. She looked toward the corner. The box was empty. Her eyes swept the room, and then she saw him. Morris was moving, not wandering, not exploring in the random, curious way that cats tend to drift through space. He was moving with intention, slow, careful, deliberate steps, his small white paws pressing gently against the linoleum floor, his nose lifted just slightly, his ears turned forward like two small antennae reading the room. He was heading toward the center, toward Calder. Alara, one of the younger volunteers, breathed beside her. "I see him," she whispered. She took a step forward, instinctively, protectively, and then stopped herself. Something made her stop. To this day, she cannot say exactly what it was. Maybe it was the certainty in Morris's steps. Maybe it was some quiet intuition she had learned over 11 years of watching animals navigate the world in ways humans don't fully understand. Maybe it was something else entirely. But she stopped, and she watched. Morris crossed the room. It took him nearly 2 full minutes. He paused twice. Once to recalibrate after a slight change in the floor's texture, once to lift his nose and confirm something in the air that only he could detect. But he never turned around, never lost his direction, never hesitated in any way that suggested fear or confusion. He was certain. He arrived at Calder's side so quietly that Calder didn't notice at first. He sat there for a moment at the base of the wheelchair. Then, with the careful deliberateness of a creature who has learned to trust its other senses completely, Morris rose up slightly on his hind legs and pressed the top of his small head against Calder's hand, the hand that had been resting, motionless and heavy, on the man's knee. Calder went absolutely still, the kind of stillness that is not the absence of movement, but the presence of something overwhelming. His eyes dropped down slowly. He looked at Morris. Morris, of course, did not look back. His clouded eyes faced forward, seeing nothing in the way they always did. But his small body leaned into Calder's hand with a gentle, unwavering pressure, as if to say, "I know you are here. I know exactly where you are, and I am not afraid." Then came the purr, low, warm, steady, like a heartbeat finding its rhythm again after a long, terrible silence. Calder's face did something then that Alara had never seen it do before. It cracked, not dramatically, not with tears or sound, just a softening, a loosening of something that had been held rigid for so long it had begun to seem permanent. His jaw unclenched, his shoulders dropped half an inch, the deep lines around his mouth shifted, not into a smile, not exactly, but into something that was the ghost of one, the memory of one. Alara pressed her hand over her mouth and said nothing. The entire shelter was silent. Even the cats who had retreated to their corners had gone still, watching, in whatever way cats watch things, as something happened in the center of that room that none of them had words for. After that day, Calder kept coming, but everything was different. He started arriving a little earlier each Tuesday and Thursday. He stayed longer. He spoke more. At first, just a few words to Alara, brief and careful, like someone testing the weight of a bridge before crossing it. Then gradually more, about the weather, about the shelter's history, about small, ordinary things that people talk about when they are slowly, cautiously, remembering how to be in the world again. And always, without fail, Morris found him. The other cats still kept their distance. That didn't change. but it didn't seem to matter anymore. Not to Calder, and not to Morris, who operated in a world entirely his own, guided by senses that the rest of them could barely imagine. Alara watched it all, and she thought. And she began quietly to ask questions. It started with a conversation with Margaret, the shelter's oldest volunteer, who had lived in Ashford her entire life and knew most of the town's stories the way people know the furniture in their own homes, by touch, without looking. Calder Voss, Margaret repeated when Alara brought up the name one afternoon. Oh, I know him, or I knew of him, years ago. Quiet man, kept to himself mostly after the accident. She paused to fold a towel with careful hands. He had a cat, you know, for years. That cat was everything to him. Alara looked up. What happened to it? Margaret was quiet for a moment. Old age, she said softly. The cat went blind toward the end. Spent his last year or so just resting against Calder's hand. That's how Calder always talked about him. Said the cat never seemed scared, even without his sight. Said it was the most peaceful thing he'd ever witnessed. The towel Margaret was folding slipped from her hands. She didn't seem to notice. The cat passed about 8 months ago, she said. Around the same time Calder started coming here. Alara said nothing, but she felt something move through her, slow and deep, like the first tremor before something enormous settles into place. That evening, after the shelter closed, Alara sat at her desk in the small back office and pulled up the intake records on her computer. She scrolled through the external reports that sometimes accompanied animals. Notes from the finders, photographs, observations. She found Morris's file. There was one photograph taken by the volunteer who had found him. A pale kitten, barely visible against the weathered wood of an old porch, curled against a chipped clay flower pot. Alara stared at it for a long time. Then she opened a separate document, a personal file she kept of notable shelter stories with photographs when she had them. She scrolled back 8 months and found what she was looking for. A photograph someone had once shown her. An old print, slightly faded, that a previous adopter had brought in as part of a donation. It showed an older cat, pale fur, eyes completely clouded with the white film of blindness, resting gently, so gently, against a man's large hand. Alara sat very still for a very long time. The resemblance was not perfect. It couldn't be. Animals are not carbon copies of one another, and the universe does not work in ways that neat or obvious. But it was close enough to make her breath go shallow. Close enough to make her close the laptop slowly, carefully, and sit in the silence of the empty shelter, listening to the soft sounds of the animals settling in for the night. Close enough to make her wonder, not for the first time and not for the last, whether some connections are simply too specific, too precise, too impossible to be anything other than intentional. Whether some souls find each other not just once, but again and again, across whatever distance separates them. The following Tuesday, Alara made a decision. She didn't announce it. She didn't explain it to the other volunteers, though she suspected Margaret might have understood. She simply waited until Calder arrived, settled into his usual spot, and then she walked to the back room where she had, that morning, placed Morris in anticipation of the visit. She carried the small kitten to the main room, set him down on the floor, gently, the way you set down something precious, and stepped back. Morris paused, his nose lifted, his ears swiveled forward, and then he moved, straight across the room. No hesitation, no detour, straight as an arrow toward the man in the wheelchair, as he had always done, as he would always do, guided by something that had nothing to do with sight and everything to do with recognition. He reached Calder. He pressed his head against the familiar hand. He purred, and this time, Calder did not freeze. This time, Calder leaned forward, slowly, with the great care of a man who has been afraid for a long time of wanting things, and he lifted Morris with both hands, holding him the way you hold something you thought you had lost forever. Morris nestled against his chest without protest, without confusion, without a single moment of the fear that new environments and new people usually inspire in animals so small and so young. He simply settled, like something returning to its place. He feels the same, Calder whispered. His voice was barely audible, rough at the edges, the voice of a man who had not said the things that mattered in a very long time. Alara stood near the doorway. She did not move. She did not speak. Some moments are not meant to be interrupted. Some moments are meant only to be witnessed and honored, and quietly, gratefully held. Calder adopted Morris 3 weeks later. The paperwork was simple. The process was straightforward. but the afternoon he came to take Morris home was anything but ordinary. The shelter was quiet in the particular way it gets on autumn afternoons, when the light comes in low through the windows and turns everything golden and soft. The other cats watched from their enclosures, not with the tension that had always accompanied Calder's presence before, but with the calm, faintly curious attention of creatures who sense that something important is happening without quite understanding what. Alara brought Morris to Calder in his carrier, a small, soft-sided thing with a mesh window and a fleece lining that smelled like the shelter, like home, like everything familiar. Calder took the carrier with both hands. He looked down through the mesh at Morris, who sat perfectly still inside, face forward, clouded eyes seeing nothing and somehow everything. "Hey, little one," Calder said softly. Morris began to purr. Calder looked up at Alara. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he said, "Thank you." 2 words, simple, ordinary, and yet the way he said them, with the full weight of everything behind them, everything unnamed and unnameable, made Alara's eyes fill with tears she had been holding back for weeks. "Take care of each other," she managed. Calder nodded once, then he turned his wheelchair toward the door, and he left. Morris, resting quietly against his chest, through the mesh of the carrier, pressed exactly where the old heartbeat used to be. Alara stood by the window and watched Calder's car pull away down the quiet street, beneath the canopy of oaks whose leaves had begun to turn, amber and copper and the deep burning red of things that are ending beautifully. She thought about what Margaret had told her. She thought about the photograph on her laptop, the pale cat, the clouded eyes, the large and gentle hand. She thought about the way Morris had crossed that room on that first afternoon, not wandering, not stumbling, but moving with the absolute certainty of a creature who knows beyond all doubt exactly where he belongs. She had spent 11 years working in animal rescue. She had learned to be careful about the stories she told herself, careful about the meaning she assigned to things that might simply be coincidence or instinct or the beautiful randomness of life. But standing at that window, watching the last sliver of Calder's car disappear around the corner, Alara found she didn't want to be careful. She wanted to believe what she felt, which was this, that love, the real kind, the deep kind. The kind that carves itself into the bones of living things, does not simply end when breath does. It continues, it searches, it finds its way back through whatever doors are left open, in whatever forms are available, guided by something older and wiser and more persistent than any grief. That sometimes when we have lost what we love most, the universe does not leave us empty-handed forever. Sometimes it sends us a small, pale, sightless kitten who crosses a room full of fear and finds us anyway. Not because he can see us, but because he already knows us. Morris lived with Calder for many years. He grew from that tiny, fragile thing into a sturdy, contented cat who navigated their shared home with the quiet confidence of someone who has memorized every corner, every texture, every beloved inch of a place that is truly his. He slept on Calder's lap in the evenings, while the television murmured and the fire crackled and the autumn deepened into winter outside their window. He pressed his head against Calder's hand in the particular way he always had, steady, warm, unwavering, and purred the low, constant purr that had become, over time, the background sound of a life rebuilt from grief. Calder spoke more, laughed occasionally, allowed neighbors in for coffee on Sunday mornings, began gradually to inhabit his life again the way a person does when they have been given a reason. And sometimes, on quiet evenings, when the light in the room was soft and golden and Morris was curled against his chest, Calder would rest his hand gently on the cat's small back and close his eyes. And whatever he thought about in those moments, whatever he felt, gratitude, wonder, the particular peace of a man who has been found after being lost, he kept mostly to himself. Some things are too sacred for words. Some things live only in the space between a hand and the creature that chooses it, between a loss and the love that answers it, between one world and the one just beyond it, where something soft and pale and sightless waited patiently until the door opened again and walked straight through. They say animals can sense things we cannot. They say some souls recognize each other across time. They say that love, once given with the whole heart, does not simply vanish when the one who held it is gone. Maybe that is true. Maybe it takes the eyes of someone who cannot see to show the rest of us what has always been there.